On Friday, July 13, 1940, in the 10th month before the United States formally entered World War II, a quiet but historic shift began inside the War Department in Washington, D.C., when Brigadier General Benjamin Oliver Davis Sr. walked into his office carrying the weight of a nation's contradictions on his shoulders. Because on that day, he became the first black general officer in the history of the United States Army, promoted at a time when segregation was law, custom, and policy, and when many senior officers openly doubted whether black soldiers should even serve in leadership roles, let alone shape the future of the Army itself. Davis's promotion did not come as a symbolic gesture or public celebration, but as a calculated response to mounting pressure on a military preparing for global conflict, because World War II was already consuming Europe and Asia, and American planners understood that manpower, organization, and morale would determine survival if the nation was drawn into war. Davis, a West Point graduate who had endured years of professional isolation, silent treatment from classmates, and deliberate marginalization throughout his career, represented both a challenge to entrenched prejudice and a practical solution to an army struggling to reconcile democratic ideals with segregated realities. His advancement marked the beginning of a transformation that would unfold gradually, often reluctantly, but decisively during World War II. From the moment of his promotion, Davis was placed in a paradoxical position because while he held the rank of general, he was assigned primarily to oversee segregated black units that the Army considered administratively necessary but strategically limited. Rather than being integrated into the general staff or given command of mixed formations, Davis was tasked with managing the very system that constrained his authority. Educational analysis of this moment shows how the Army attempted to balance political pressure from civil rights advocates with institutional resistance, using Davis's leadership to stabilize segregated units while avoiding deeper structural reform. Yet within these constraints, Davis began reshaping expectations through disciplined organization, rigorous standards, and a refusal to accept the low-performance assumptions imposed on black soldiers. When the United States entered World War II after December 7, 1941, the demands placed on the Army expanded rapidly, and Davis's responsibilities grew accordingly. The rapid mobilization required the training, housing, and deployment of hundreds of thousands of black soldiers, many of whom were assigned to labor, transportation, and service roles under segregated command structures. Davis insisted that these units receive proper training, adequate equipment, and competent leadership, understanding that poor preparation would reinforce prejudiced beliefs and undermine future opportunities. His approach reflected a broader educational principle that institutional change often begins not with rhetoric but with measurable performance that forces reassessment of entrenched assumptions. As the war progressed, Davis became a central figure in addressing racial tension within the military, particularly in training camps across the American South, where segregation was enforced by both military policy and local law. Incidents of violence, discrimination, and unequal treatment threatened morale and readiness, and Davis was frequently dispatched to investigate and mediate conflicts that senior white officers either dismissed or mishandled. His reports emphasized discipline, fairness, and the direct link between morale and combat effectiveness, arguing that racial injustice weakened the Army's ability to fight World War II efficiently. These arguments reframed civil rights concerns as matters of military necessity, a strategy that gradually gained traction within wartime command circles. One of Davis's most significant contributions during World War II came through his advocacy for the proper utilization of black officers and non-commissioned leaders, whose careers were often stalled regardless of competence. Davis pushed for expanded training programs and leadership development, emphasizing that an army preparing for global war could not afford to sideline capable personnel based on race alone. Educational historians note that this insistence on professional standards helped establish a paper trail of evaluations, performance metrics, and command reports that later undermined arguments supporting segregation. Davis did not challenge the system through protest, but through relentless documentation and insistence on accountability within the Army's own bureaucratic framework. In 1942 and 1943, as American forces deployed across North Africa and Europe, reports from the field began to confirm what Davis had long argued, that black units performed effectively when properly trained and led. Transportation battalions, engineer units, and anti-aircraft regiments, composed largely of black soldiers, played critical roles in sustaining operations during World War II, often under dangerous conditions. Davis used these reports strategically, circulating them among senior commanders to counter claims of inherent inadequacy. His methodical approach transformed battlefield performance into evidence for policy debate, bridging the gap between operational reality and institutional reform. Davis's influence extended beyond logistics and administration into broader questions of military citizenship, as he engaged with policymakers who worried that racial inequality within the Army undermined America's international image. During World War II, propaganda emphasized freedom and democracy, yet foreign observers and allied partners were aware of segregation within U.S. forces. Davis articulated how discriminatory practices damaged credibility abroad, particularly among colonial troops and civilian populations encountering American soldiers for the first time. His perspective helped align civil rights concerns with strategic communication, reinforcing the idea that equality was not merely a domestic issue, but a factor in global legitimacy during wartime. Despite his rank, Davis continued to face personal discrimination, often being excluded from social spaces, denied housing accommodations, or treated as a liaison rather than a decision-maker by fellow generals. Yet his response remained consistent. He focused on outcomes rather than recognition, understanding that his effectiveness depended on maintaining access to decision-making channels. His leadership style during World War II emphasized restraint, professionalism, and long-term strategy, qualities that historians later identified as critical to navigating hostile institutional environments without sacrificing authority or credibility. As manpower shortages intensified in late 1944, the Army began experimenting with limited integration, allowing black volunteers from service units to serve as riflemen in white infantry divisions during emergencies such as the Battle of the Bulge. Although Davis was not directly responsible for these decisions, the groundwork he laid made them possible because his years of documentation and advocacy had already challenged assumptions about capability. The success of these volunteers further weakened the rationale for segregation, reinforcing arguments Davis had advanced since before the United States entered World War II. By 1945, as victory in Europe approached, Davis's role evolved again as he contributed to post-war planning discussions about the future structure of the Army. While segregation remained official policy at the war's end, the evidence accumulated during World War II made its continuation increasingly difficult to justify. Davis emphasized that the Army's effectiveness depended on unified standards, equal opportunity for advancement, and the elimination of policies that undermined cohesion. His arguments did not immediately dismantle segregation, but they shaped the intellectual and administrative foundation for reforms that would follow. Educational studies of military desegregation often highlight Davis's ability to operate within existing systems while subtly transforming them, demonstrating how leadership can function as a force for change even under restrictive conditions. His career illustrates how World War II served as a catalyst for institutional reflection, exposing contradictions between democratic rhetoric and military practice. By insisting on measurable performance, disciplined leadership, and documented outcomes, Davis forced the Army to confront its own inefficiencies rooted in discrimination.
After the war, Davis continued to serve in advisory roles, contributing to discussions that eventually led to the desegregation of the armed forces under President Harry Truman in 1948. While that decision occurred after World War II, its intellectual origins traced directly to the wartime experiences Davis helped shape. His leadership provided continuity between wartime necessity and peacetime reform, illustrating how change often emerges incrementally through sustained effort rather than sudden revolution. The story of how one black general changed the U.S. Army during World War II is not confined to a single decision or battlefield, but unfolds through years of persistent advocacy, disciplined administration, and strategic engagement with power. Davis did not command armies in combat, yet his influence reshaped how armies were built, trained, and evaluated. His legacy lies in the quiet transformation of policy through evidence, professionalism, and unwavering commitment to the principle that an army fighting for democracy must strive to reflect it within its own ranks, a process that continued to expand long after the final battles of World War II had ended.
In the months immediately following the surrender of Germany in May 1945, the institutional momentum generated during World War II did not simply dissipate, and Benjamin O. Davis Sr. remained a critical reference point within the War Department as senior leaders assessed what the conflict had revealed about manpower, leadership, and efficiency. Internal memoranda circulated among generals increasingly acknowledged that segregation had complicated logistics, training pipelines, and unit cohesion. And while these documents rarely credited Davis by name, their language echoed arguments he had advanced consistently throughout the war. The Army's own data now demonstrated that segregated structures required duplication of facilities, instructors, and command staffs, creating inefficiencies that could no longer be justified in an era of global military responsibility. During this transitional period, Davis was consulted on reports evaluating the performance of black units across multiple theaters, including Europe and the Pacific, and these assessments revealed patterns that directly contradicted pre-war assumptions. Units that received equal training, competent leadership, and clear missions performed comparably to their white counterparts, while failures were overwhelmingly linked to inadequate preparation rather than race. Educational analysis of these findings highlights how World War II forced the Army to rely on empirical evidence rather than tradition, and Davis's earlier insistence on documentation ensured that this evidence was preserved, organized, and difficult to ignore. At the same time, returning black veterans began asserting their rights more forcefully, having served in a war framed as a fight for freedom and democracy. Although Davis did not engage in public activism, his wartime role positioned him as an internal advocate who understood both the aspirations of these veterans and the institutional constraints of the military. He warned policymakers that failing to address inequality would damage recruitment, retention, and public trust, especially as the Army transitioned into a peacetime force during the early Cold War. His arguments framed civil rights not as a concession, but as a strategic necessity grounded in the lessons of World War II. Within military education institutions, including command and staff colleges, curricula began to incorporate lessons learned from wartime mobilization, and discussions of manpower increasingly acknowledged the limitations imposed by segregation. While these changes were subtle, they reflected a shift in professional military thought, one that Davis had helped cultivate through years of measured engagement. Instructors and planners now confronted the reality that racial exclusion had constrained operational flexibility during World War II, particularly when manpower shortages demanded rapid adaptation.
Davis's influence also extended into international contexts, as American military leaders recognized that future conflicts would require cooperation with allies and engagement with populations around the world. The contradiction between American ideals and segregated practices had been noted by foreign observers during World War II, and Davis emphasized that credibility abroad depended on reform at home. His perspective aligned with emerging strategic concerns, particularly as the United States sought to position itself as a leader of the free world in the post-war order. By the late 1940s, the cumulative weight of wartime experience, internal studies, and political pressure converged into concrete policy debate, culminating in the decision to desegregate the armed forces. Although this policy change occurred after World War II, its foundations were unmistakably rooted in the wartime environment Davis helped shape. His career demonstrated how sustained leadership within rigid institutions can generate long-term transformation by aligning moral imperatives with operational effectiveness. Davis's role underscores how World War II functioned as a proving ground, not only for weapons and tactics, but for ideas about equality, leadership, and national identity. His contribution was not dramatic or confrontational, but structural and enduring, revealing how change within the U.S. Army emerged through accumulated evidence and persistent professionalism. As the Army moved forward, the systems Davis challenged and reshaped during World War II continued to evolve, carrying forward lessons forged under the pressures of global war and redefining what leadership meant within a democratic military.
As the desegregation process began to take shape, analysts within the Pentagon revisited manpower studies compiled during World War II, many of which had been influenced directly or indirectly by the administrative groundwork laid during Davis's tenure. These studies revealed that black officers who had advanced through segregated systems often demonstrated exceptional adaptability, having navigated constraints that demanded both discipline and restraint. Military educators later highlighted this adaptability as an unintended byproduct of segregation, noting that leaders like Davis had mastered bureaucratic negotiation, long-term planning, and institutional memory in ways that proved valuable during reform. The Army's gradual shift away from racial separation thus rested on an intellectual foundation built during wartime, not merely on political decree. As integrated units were tested in the late 1940s and early 1950s, performance reports echoed conclusions first reached during World War II, confirming that cohesion depended on leadership standards rather than racial composition. Officers trained under doctrines revised after the war increasingly cited wartime case studies involving black units to reinforce lessons on command responsibility and morale. Davis's legacy appeared not as a single reform, but as a reference framework embedded within training manuals, policy drafts, and internal evaluations, shaping how future generations of officers understood both efficiency and justice within a military system. The broader academic community also began to reassess World War II through a more inclusive lens, as access to military archives expanded and scholars examined how segregation affected operational outcomes. Studies of logistics, personnel management, and command structures frequently returned to Davis's wartime correspondence and testimony, treating them as primary sources that illuminated the intersection of race and military effectiveness. In university classrooms and war colleges alike, these materials became tools for understanding how institutional bias can undermine strategic objectives, reinforcing the educational value of Davis's experience beyond the confines of military history. Internationally, the example of American military reform carried symbolic weight, particularly as newly independent nations emerged in the post-war period.
Observers in Europe, Africa, and Asia remembered the presence of segregated American units during World War II and watched closely as the United States confronted its own contradictions. Diplomatic historians later noted that the credibility of American military assistance programs often depended on visible progress toward equality, a reality Davis had anticipated when he argued that discrimination weakened national security. His wartime insights thus resonated far beyond the Army itself, influencing how military power was perceived on the global stage. Within veteran communities, stories of service under segregated conditions continued to circulate, reinforcing a collective memory shaped by both pride and frustration. Many veterans recognized Davis as a figure who had navigated the system without abandoning principle, and his career became a point of reference in discussions about leadership under constraint. Oral histories collected decades later frequently returned to moments from World War II when policy decisions made at the highest levels filtered down to daily routines, affecting training assignments, promotions, and the distribution of risk on the battlefield. As military doctrine evolved during the Cold War, planners increasingly emphasized flexibility and rapid mobilization, lessons derived in part from the total war environment of World War II. Segregation, once defended as tradition, came to be understood as an obstacle to these goals, and this shift reflected arguments Davis had articulated years earlier. His influence persisted not through public acclaim, but through institutional habits of evaluation and reform, ensuring that the Army's approach to personnel management remained grounded in evidence rather than assumption. Davis's role highlights how World War II served as a crucible for social as well as military transformation, forcing institutions to confront realities they could no longer ignore. His career illustrates how sustained professionalism within a constrained system can produce enduring change, shaping policy through persistence rather than confrontation. As historians and educators continue to uncover new documents and testimonies, the narrative surrounding his impact remains open, inviting further exploration into how leadership during World War II reshaped the U.S. Army in ways that extended far beyond the battlefield.
As additional archival collections were declassified in the late 20th century, researchers uncovered further correspondence that traced how arguments first raised during World War II continued to circulate quietly through advisory boards and personnel committees long after the conflict ended. These documents revealed that Davis's assessments were often cited indirectly, referenced through anonymized summaries or incorporated into broader policy language, a method that reflected both the caution of the era and the persistence of his influence. Educational reviews of these records emphasize how institutional change often advances through incremental adaptation rather than overt acknowledgement, particularly within hierarchical organizations like the U.S. Army. Military sociologists studying post-war reforms increasingly pointed to World War II as a turning point in how the Army evaluated human potential, noting that large-scale mobilization had forced leaders to confront realities that peacetime structures could previously obscure. Davis's insistence on standardized evaluation criteria became increasingly relevant as the Army faced new conflicts that demanded rapid expansion and technical proficiency. Training commands began to rely more heavily on aptitude testing, leadership assessment, and performance metrics, reinforcing a merit-based approach that aligned closely with the principles he had defended during the war. Within officer education programs, case studies drawn from World War II highlighted moments when segregated policies had constrained operational choices, particularly during emergencies that required immediate redeployment of personnel. These lessons were presented not as moral critiques, but as practical analyses, allowing future commanders to understand how organizational rigidity can undermine battlefield effectiveness. Davis's wartime experience thus became embedded in professional discourse, shaping how officers were taught to balance discipline, fairness, and adaptability under pressure. The long-term impact of these shifts became visible during subsequent conflicts when integrated units operated as a standard practice rather than an experiment.
Analysts reviewing these developments often traced their origins back to World War II manpower crises, where necessity had exposed the weaknesses of segregation. Davis's role during that period provided a consistent reference point for understanding how leadership grounded in evidence can influence institutional culture even when formal authority is limited. In academic settings, interdisciplinary studies began to connect military reform with broader social change, using World War II as a framework for examining how war accelerates transformations that might otherwise take decades. Davis's career featured prominently in these discussions, not as a symbol, but as an example of how individuals navigate structural barriers while remaining committed to professional standards. His approach demonstrated that reform within large institutions often depends on the ability to translate ethical concerns into operational language that decision-makers cannot easily dismiss. As public history initiatives expanded, museums and documentary projects incorporated these perspectives into exhibits that contextualized World War II beyond conventional narratives of strategy and combat. Visitors encountered explanations of how logistics, training systems, and personnel policies shaped outcomes, and how leaders like Davis influenced these systems from within. This educational framing encouraged audiences to view military history as a complex interaction between policy, practice, and human experience. The continued study of Davis's influence underscores how World War II reshaped not only global geopolitics, but also internal American institutions, compelling them to confront contradictions between stated ideals and operational realities. His legacy remains embedded in the Army's ongoing commitment to professional evaluation and equal opportunity, a commitment that evolved gradually from wartime necessity into institutional principle. As new scholarship emerges and additional records are examined, the narrative continues to expand, revealing further connections between leadership decisions made during World War II and the long-term transformation of the U.S. Army's structure and values.